Okay, Beth's going to be passing out some handouts, just a handout of the PowerPoint and then a little supplemental paper for you that will help in this. My name is Deborah Adkins. I'm a Senior Research Associate with Northwest Evaluation Association. We are a globally based non-for-profit educational organization. We've got 30 years of experience. Someone's across there. We've got 30 years experience in developing assessments, providing professional development, and conducting educational research, or research on education. The topic of my study was, is decoding sufficient to predict reading ability in kindergarten through second grade students? The purpose of this is really to provide additional information to teachers and educators as to how they might interpret their data and how they might use it to further differentiate instruction. So, brief overview. We'll go over what the current theory of reading is and what type of research this is in relation to that. Which method I chose and why. What was found, what does it mean, and where we go from here. So the current theory of reading is that reading is as a result of an interaction between the text and the student. And this research is not looking at the text aspect of it. It is looking at measuring the interaction or students' reading ability. And we do that with audio-aided, computerized adaptive tests. These tests are provided in 2 segments. Items are administered based on, or they're administered and everything is scored based on item response theory. They're administered in 2 segments to make it so that students in this young age are more likely to get through each of the segments without being fatigued, and they're able to hold their attention for that time span. The first segment addresses decoding. It does that with 3 goals. Those goals are goals are phonological awareness, phonics, and concepts of print. The second segment also uses 3 goals, and it assesses essentially comprehension, and it does that through vocabulary, comprehension, and writing. The other aspects we're looking at are student aspects and what they bring to this interaction. We're looking at decoding again through that segment 1 score. We're also looking at how they perform on 10 discrete decoding skills. And those 10 skills are consonant blends and digraphs, decoding multisyllable words, decoding words, word patterns, word families and patterns, letter identification, matching letters to sounds, manipulation of sounds, phonemic identification, phonological awareness, syllable types, and vowel digraphs and diphthongs. Oh, and those are also a computer-administered test, but they're not adaptive like the reading test. They're actually essentially fixed form tests where all the students see the same items, however they're administered in a random order so that it's less likely that partnering students are going to see the same item at the same time. The other thing we're looking at is comprehension, and we're just looking at that through the segment 1 score. What we're not looking at past these 2 is any further student experience. Okay, so how do we do that? We do that through regression, and the reason regression was selected was that it allows us to do 2 important things. It allows us to examine the relationship between each of these discrete decoding skills and what it is that they're trying to predict. And it also allows us to examine the relationships among the discrete skills. So the first one, letting us look at the relationship between each of the discrete skills on their own as they relate to reading overall. When it's for predictive purposes, we want this to be a strong to a moderately strong relationship, otherwise it's not much used predictively. Looking at the relationship between the variables is important because if the variables have a very low correlation with one another, then that tells us that regression is going to be the end of the analysis. We're not going to have to go any further. However, if they're moderately or highly correlated with one another, then we'd want to move into hierarchical regression so that we're not emphasizing the importance of any one particular variable. The data in the study consisted of 541 students from kindergarten to second grade, and I'll show you the breakdown of those students. The students were administered each of these 10 discrete skill checklist tests, both segment 1 and segment 2, and they all received a combined reading score. All of the test events occurred within the same school year for each student record. So if I was a kindergartner taking letter identification, I also took my reading test that same school year. Okay, so the initial results of the regression, and this addresses the relationship between each of the discrete skills and what it is that they're trying to predict. And R-square is just a measure of the variability in the reading score that can be attributed to each one of these skills when looked at individually. And what we want to see is pretty much what we see for the first 8 skills, where you have a somewhat even distribution across that regression line. What's cause for alarm are the 2 skills on the bottom, the letter identification and the matching letters to sounds. This handout here tells you what those acronyms mean, what the specific test names are, and gives you examples of the different types of items that might be presented in any of these tests. So here with the letter identification and matching letters to sounds, which are the bottom 2, you'll see that they're both very highly negatively skewed. So that's a reason for concern and something we want to look at as we progress. The other thing is we want to know what the relationship between each of these skills were. You'll see a column there that says RIT. That's the RIT score for the reading test. It's based on a Roche transformation of a logit, or a transformation of a logit score on these adaptive tests. So that represents the actual reading score. And the others are just the discrete skills. And what you'll notice here is that all of them, with the exception of letter identification and matching letters to sounds, have moderately high to high correlations. Although if you look at the column for letter identification and go down to matching letters to sounds, you'll see that between those 2 variables, the skewed ones, they have a moderately high correlation with one another. Okay. So these were the 2 skills that were highly skewed in our initial scatter plots. And so what these histograms show is the top row is letter identification, and the bottom row is matching letters to sounds. On the left, you've got students who are proficient in that skill, and on the right, you've got students who are not proficient. 92% of the students in this sample were proficient in letter identification, and that was true across all 3 of the grades. Similarly, matching letters to sounds, 86% of the students were proficient in this skill. And also, that was true across all grades. And what this tells us, these are just foundational skills. Looking at it another way, now if we graph it across the reading score scale, what you'll see is that the non-proficient students are consistently scoring lower than the proficient students. So, although it didn't have any significant impact on the reading score as a whole, this tells us that the students who aren't proficient are consistently lower, but that students at the high end of the scales are seeming to compensate in some other manner. Even though they're not proficient, they're still scoring fairly well on the reading test. So, the results of the regression analysis. With regression analysis, you throw all the variables in at once, and you say that as a whole, these variability in the test scores can be attributed to all of these 10 skills checklists together. And had the correlations been much lower than what they were, this would have been sufficient. So here for the reading score, about 64% of the variability can be attributed to what we know on how the student performs on each of these 10 skills checklist tests. When we divide it into the segments, so the decoding segment, which is segment 1, about 50% of the variability can be attributed to these skills. And for the segment 2, which is the comprehension segment, about 60% of the variability can be attributed to these scores. During the regression, what we found is that only 4 of these 10 skills contributed in a significant manner. Also, because of the high correlations, we want to know that as we add each variable in, how much additional variability in the scores is attributed to that single skill as it gets added into the equation. And standard multiple regression won't tell you that. So we moved into hierarchical regression. And so now it begins to paint a little bit of a different picture for you here. So the way we entered the variables in was by taking the significant variables, entering them in individually, and based upon which of the skills contributed or had the most impact on the mean score. And so for reading combined score, that was phonological awareness, followed by phonemic identification, vowel digraphs and diphthongs, and decoding multisyllable words. The last two sets, you'll see that letter identification and matching letters to sounds were put in last and by themselves. It's because not only were they not significant like the other four, but they also violated the assumption of homoscedasticity. The other four, not significant, so they were also lumped together. When you look down at the segment 1 and the segment 2 reading score, now we've dropped down to only 3 of the skills that are statistically significant for predicting each of these scores. The 2 skills that they share are phonological awareness and phoneme identification. Segment 1, the decoding segment, vowel digraphs and diphthongs is no longer significant, just decoding multisyllable words. Conversely, segment 2, decoding multisyllable words is no longer significant, but vowel digraphs and diphthongs is. And vowel digraphs and diphthongs is now the most influential variable as far as the comprehension segment went. So what does this all mean? Does decoding sufficiently predict reading ability in kindergarten, first and second grade students? If you look at the wording, does it sufficiently? No, it doesn't sufficiently. So statistically, accounting for 64% of the variable is quite a lot. But if you're a classroom teacher, you don't want to hang your hat on 64%. You want to know a little bit more about what the student knows. And the same with when you look at each of the segments. It accounts for 57% of the decoding segment and 60% of the comprehension segment. But what we learned is that there are 4 variables that do contribute statistically significantly to the overall reading score. And that when you further decompose the test into the 2 segments, they share phonological awareness and phonemic identification, but they differ on their 3rd variable. And letter identification and matching letters to sounds are foundational skills that most children master, so it's not necessary to continue review of these skills if they've already shown that they've mastered these skills. Also, when the theory of reading transitioned from the top down or the whole language theory to this interactive theory back around 1980, Stanovich had written a paper suggesting that reading was this interaction, and then he also introduced that there was this compensatory component. And so what was found with the letter identification and matching letters to sounds seems to support that statement and his finding. The other thing is that the effect indicated by each skill individually when we looked back at those scatter plots is not additive. So if you looked back at those and you said, well, 45.5% of the variability in the reading scores can be attributed to what the student knows on phonemic identification, and 48.4% can be attributed to what they know on phonological awareness. It doesn't mean that almost 94% of the variability can be attributed to what they know about those skills together. Instead, it's only 54.5%. So where do we go from here? You can certainly expand on Stanovich's interactive compensatory model of individual differences by further examining how those students who were not proficient in those 2 foundational skills were compensating. You could include comprehension skills. These tests only had discrete skills for decoding and not for comprehension. So if you have those types of tests, you could add that into the mix and see to what extent they account for the variability in scores. You could also see if the findings generalize to other groups, either based on socioeconomic status or ethnicity or on gender. That's it. Are there any questions? Yes.
Since you're using computers, did you record latencies?
We record it, but we don't use it.
Yeah.
So we have the information.
But do you not use it because you don't think it's worthwhile, or do you not use it because you haven't gotten around to it yet?
Because we haven't gotten around to
Okay.
it.
No, some early data
And then
says it-
also being able to pinpoint exactly where the latency is. So contingent upon which computer you're using and how long it takes the item to render. I mean, we get a pretty close approximation, but we don't have the precision that we'd like.
Yeah, okay. And I was wondering about spelling patterns as opposed to individual letters and things like that.
That's
Did you look at spelling patterns?
I've got one of my content people here because I'm a psychometrician.
I'm just looking at which test has the spelling patterns in it.
I mean, I'm always bothered by the things that, the
Yeah.
it's supposed to be bat, but there's no but in it, there's no t in it. There's an at, but there is a b and an at. And so that's why I was wondering about spelling patterns.
Just, we touch on it just very slightly in some of the different checklist tests, but it's not to the degree, it's not comprehensive. It's not going to go through all the different spelling patterns that could possibly come up.
Yeah. And and finally, did you test for regular non-words?
No,
No.
nonsense words. No, we didn't do that.
Do you,
I'm sorry.
do you anticipate having data on these kids in grades 3 and 4?
I would imagine that we already do.
Good.
Again, we've got 30 years worth of data. And so this data set, we just started this program at the end of 2005. And so this data set is as a result of test events pulled from fall of 2007 through spring of 2010.
I raise this because a number of studies have tended to show that if you go up to grade 3 and 4, that basically the early decoding related skills fade. They don't disappear, but they fade as predictors. Language-related measures increase as predictors.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see if the data follow that pattern.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much.